Before, we've looked at games that killed their franchise, and we've reviewed games that were received with negative reception. However, this time, rather than looking at how some games has affected their franchise, we're looking at how they affected their fans. It's a juggling act for game development companies to build up a fanbase and then appease them with a flow of praised sequels. While keeping this up, all it takes is one game to shake this foundation and have people question their loyalty to a franchise. And that's what we're looking at today. Here's the top 10 games that disappointed fans. Spyro was once a successful 3D platformer series, with 3 PlayStation games developed by Insomniac. Then Insomniac moved on. The next 2 Spyro games were developed by Digital Eclipse for the Game Boy Advance, and while they weren't up to the standards of the original trilogy, they weren't bad. And then Check 6 Games and Equinox Digital Entertainment developed a 4th console Spyro game for the PlayStation 2 and GameCube, called Spyro Enter the Dragonfly. Enter the Dragonfly began the series' spiral into oblivion. It was a bland, rushed game that suffered from numerous glitches and attempted to mimic the trilogy's formula without success. It introduced frustrating new mechanics and left fans of the series disappointed with Spyro's new direction. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon is a roguelike dungeon crawler spin-off series developed by Spike Chunsoft. The originals did fairly well, and the follow-up Explorer games were especially praised for their storytelling. So when Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity was announced, fans were understandably excited to see how it would improve on its predecessors. Unfortunately, it didn't. Gates to Infinity simplified its gameplay and shortened the main content in favour of introducing DLC dungeons that most players found unfulfilling. While it had a few positive additions, the bad outweighed the good. Fortunately for fans of the series, Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon released a few years later, and was a major improvement. To many fans of the Tales series, the original Tales of Symphonia stands out as one of the best games in the series. For some, it's one of the best JRPGs overall. With that in mind, people were very excited when Namco announced the sequel. But while Tales of Symphonia Dawn of the New World wasn't a terrible JRPG, it was nowhere near what fans expected from a Tales of Symphonia successor. A few chunky gameplay changes, a lackluster plot, a main character many players considered annoying, and poor utilisation of the returning Symphonia cast led to a great disappointment among fans. Dawn of the New World is one of those odd games where your perspective depends on your familiarity with the series. If you play it first, you'll likely find it to be a decent RPG with an irritating protagonist. If you play it after the first Tales of Symphonia, however, you'll understand why fans were so disappointed. The Final Fantasy series was a JRPG juggernaut, dominating the genre for years. Fans were hotly divided over which games were the best, but nothing split the fanbase quite like Final Fantasy XIII did. Final Fantasy XIII introduced a new battle system that some fans felt was the high point and others felt it was the low point. As for its story, an intriguing premise couldn't make up for the poorly told, convoluted narrative starring one of the most hated casts of characters in Final Fantasy history. Meanwhile, on the other side, a cast of underutilized villains dropped away in favour of a main antagonist many players found to be painfully uninteresting. But while fans could have debated these topics like any other Final Fantasy game, what really hurt Final Fantasy XIII was its linearity. Make no mistake, Final Fantasy X had an incredibly linear progression, but at least it had open areas along the way. Final Fantasy XIII was almost entirely made up of narrow corridors, with no towns and nothing to do except run from battle to battle. After about 20 to 30 hours, you accessed an open area where you could complete side quests, and by that I mean optional battles and bounty style quests, but it was too little too late. Banjo-Kazooie and its sequel, Banjo-Tooie, were popular 3D platformers for the Nintendo 64. After the release of Banjo-Tooie in 2000, the series remained quiet, aside from a couple spin-offs, until 2008. After 8 years, Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts came out for the Xbox 360. It wasn't the Banjo 3 fans had hoped for. It wasn't even a platformer. Nuts and Bolts scrapped all of the series' traditional gameplay in favour of vehicle-based gameplay where players built vehicles to complete challenges in a series of new worlds. Fans were not pleased. To be fair, the game wasn't all bad. It still had Banjo-Kazooie's sense of humour, although a couple jabs at the series' old gameplay style didn't sit well with fans. As a vehicle-based game, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't a Banjo-Kazooie game. Since then, fans have more or less given up on getting a true sequel and have turned their attention instead to Yooka-Laylee, a spiritual successor developed by former Rare employees. The Resident Evil series saw division among fans after Resident Evil 4. With an over-the-shoulder angle and a focus on shooting instead of puzzle solving, it was the first game in the series to really veer into action. Nevertheless, many people loved it, and it's one of the most popular Resident Evil games. Resident Evil 5 upped the action further, which proved controversial, but it was Resident Evil 6 that really disappointed fans. Capcom had become aware of the schism in its fanbase, so with Resident Evil 6, it attempted to appeal everyone by splitting the game into 4 campaigns. Leon's campaign claimed to be a return to survival horror, although it really played like Resident Evil 4. Chris's followed the style of Resident Evil 5, Jake's was a new style of action, and Ada's added more puzzles in another attempt to appeal to classic fans. It didn't work. Resident Evil 6 took the series so far into the action genre, not even Capcom considered it survival horror, but it didn't even succeed as an action game. Few people on either side of the action versus horror debate were pleased with Resident Evil 6, and it remains to be seen if the series can salvage itself. Duke Nukem Forever deserves a high place on this list because of how strong people's disappointment in it was. But it's oddly controversial in that some fans insist it was a fine Duke Nukem game. People just expected too much from it. Duke Nukem Forever was in development for 15 years. When it finally came out in 2011, it felt like a game that should have been released 15 years earlier. Its combat was clunky, and the level design was bland and tedious. A slower pace, more suited for modern shooters, mashed up with overall gameplay straight from old shooters, made it feel tedious and uninspired. Add in technical issues and juvenile humour, and it's little wonder Duke Nukem Forever wasn't the instant hit fans hoped for. Metroid fans are not a happy bunch these days. After all, the cooperative spin-off Federation Force was the first new Metroid game since the Metroid Prime trilogy. Yes, some fans prefer to outright disavow the existence of Metroid Other M, which attempted to be more a story-driven Metroid game, and failed. Instead of finding upgrades as you explore, like in traditional Metroid games, Other M decided to give Samus her usual upgrades from the start. She's just not authorized to use them until her team gives permission. It defies logic to be in a dangerous situation and simply not be allowed to use your best equipment. Other aspects of the gameplay were simplified. Its design was more linear, the heavy storytelling and dialogue wasn't particularly good, and many fans took issue with Samus's personality. Metroid Other M wasn't the new Metroid game fans were hoping for, and we have yet to see that game. Paper Mario was the second Mario spin-off in the RPG genre, following Super Mario RPG. It was a charming game with memorable characters and an enjoyable plot. Its sequel, Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, improved upon an already good formula and became many fans' favourite game in the series. The third game, Super Paper Mario, drew some controversy due to being an action RPG platformer instead of a turn-based game, but still won people over with a surprisingly epic story. And then, Paper Mario Sticker Star happened. When the developers sat down to make the next Paper Mario game, they began work on a sequel in the style of the Thousand Year Door. Partway through, however, they were told to avoid new characters, change the gameplay, and minimize the story as much as possible. The result was a game without RPG elements, actual characters, or a plot. Worse, the new combat system, with its reliance on one-time use items and no rewards, made battling pointless at best and damaging at worst. On top of all that, Sticker Star forced players to solve illogical puzzles made more frustrating by a limited inventory system. Sticker Star was a disaster, and its altered development left fans dreaming of what could have been. If there's one fanbase even unhappier than the Paper Mario fans, Metroid fans, and all others on this list, it's the Sonic fans. Sonic the Hedgehog has fallen into trouble, with multiple games that received negative reviews, and the worst was the 2006 game called simply Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 was made for the series' 15th anniversary, but fans had little reason to celebrate with this game. Long loading times, numerous bugs, clunky controls, and a bad story made it not only a bad Sonic game, but one of the worst games of the generation. For reasons unknown, the writers also decided to include an implied romance between Sonic and a human, leading to some impressively cringeworthy moments. Overall, it was a disappointment to just about everyone, and that's why we consider Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 to be the #1 game that disappointed fans. I hope you enjoyed this week's list, and if you did, leave a like, and if you want to see more lists now, click here for my top 10 bizarre survival horror puzzles, or here for my top 10 biggest video game box art errors. And if you want to see more in the future, subscribe.